All right. Welcome back, everybody. Today, what I really want to highlight, because I know we did talk about challenges of the Articles of Confederation some time ago, right? So I really want to hop into 1.5, right? Talking about the Constitutional Convention, or what I put here, the Constitutional Compromises. So we did talk about this bell ringer in class on Friday. So what I really want to do, I don't want to take too much time to go over 1.5. I do want to highlight the key points and key vocabulary and make those necessary connections for your AP exam. Okay. So I'm going to be, I have my drawing tablet again. I'm going to be drawing and doing some illustrations, right? I would encourage you all to follow along while I'm in the sketch pad over here in this tab, okay? All right, so if make sure you're on slide 4 as you're following along. If you need to be taking notes, I would, that would be greatly appreciated and really beneficial for yourself, okay? All right, so let's talk about the Constitutional Convention and constitutional compromises, okay? What we need to really get nailed down, right, is, these different states coming together to ratify the Articles of Confederation, okay? That's important that we do that, all right? So make sure you're on slide 4. Let's follow along. So our story is going to begin in the summer of 1787, right? So we know it's going to start in the summer 1787 in Philadelphia, in Philly. All right, in Philly, PA, stands for Pennsylvania. Okay, we know, excuse me, we know they were there to amend or means change or edit the Articles of Confederation, right? That's what they were there for. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what your stance is, right? Something drastically different happens. It turns into a constitutional convention, right? Which means what they set out to do originally is completely flipped on its head now, right? And a constitutional convention essentially drafts an entirely new government. That's how we get the constitution that we have today, right? So, I need you all to know this was not unanimous, right? This was a major push by a group called Federalists, all right? A bunch of Federalists, okay? And remember this key vocab term. This is very important that you know this, right? Um, these people here, okay, their main goal or main want in this new country that we lived in, right? They supported strong central government. Strong central government. All this means is they wanted big government. Big government. Okay. Those are Federalists, right? Um, they were joined by these moderates who recognized that the AOC, right, was not working. It was kind of a failure, right? And on the other side, right, another key vocab term, right? If these are Federalists, then we had these people called anti-Federalists, right? And we talked about it a little bit in class, but these were people who, you know, opposed, right? They were against what I call big government, okay? They wanted the states to do their thing, right? Wanted state governments. Cool. So we know who a federalist is, we know who an anti federalist is, right? They wanted the power to stay within the states, these anti federalists, okay? So let's talk about a bit about diversity between the people in these two groups, right? Because it just wasn't about federalist versus anti-federalist ideology. The states themselves had wildly different interests. Think about it. You had large states at the time like Virginia with huge populations, right? So, you had a state like Virginia. This is a I'm about to do a terrible drawing of Virginia, but you'll get the idea, right? And there's a lot of people in Virginia, tons of people, right? Virginia was probably the biggest state in the country at the time. Those are supposed to be like the heads of people, but a bunch of them look like sixes or like open circles. Again, I can't draw. Okay. All right. But then you have these really small states like Delaware, right? Delaware was a tiny state, right? Which means they didn't have their diversity, right? Actually, let's put Delaware down here. Let's put DE, right? Delaware. I don't even know how Delaware is supposed to be shaped, but we're gonna make it look like this or something, right? It's a small state, little bit of people, right? So tiny bit of people in Delaware, okay? With these large states and these small states, you had northern states with growing commercial economies versus southern states who were dependent on agriculture, right, and slavery, right? So Virginia is considered a southern state, and Delaware was considered a northern state with, think of a booming commercial industry like finance, right? Commercial industries like finance, right? Or what we call money. Well, the South really needed, agriculture and slavery, right? That's how, and slavery provided this, okay? That's how they made their money. Two different, very different economies, okay? So we know that about Virginia and Delaware, all right? These culturally and economically diverse states all had their interest to protect, right? So on the AP exam, what's probably going to happen is they're going to ask you to analyze how the structure of government reflects competing interests and compromises. So you understanding these regional and ideological differences are really key to you doing well, right? So as such, the convention and the aftermath of the convention were defined by a series of debates and compromises, right? And among the issues were five compromises deemed necessary for ratification. Actually, if we come back to this page right here, here were some, they were the main five compromises that were made. The great compromise between the New Jersey and the Virginia plan, right? The Electoral College, right? The Three-Fifths Compromise, the postponement of a ban on imported slaves, and the adoption of a Bill of Rights. The adoption of the Bill of Rights was mainly to protect anti-federalist interests. Meanwhile, the Great Compromise, right, was all about federalist interests. Okay, so let's talk about them one by one. Let's talk about the Great Compromise. Cool. Let's actually start a new page really quick. Okay. The Great Compromise is also called the Connecticut Compromise. So that might be a key thing to kind of nail down. Great Compromise, also called Connecticut Compromise, right? Okay, right? Great Compromise called Connecticut Compromise. You need to know both names, okay? It is crucial that you know it because this was the agreement reached during the Constitutional Convention in 1787, right? So here's the problem that it solved. It resolved this really big issue of representation in the new bicameral legislature, right? That's a vocab word. Bicameral means two chambers or houses, right? So this is a vocab word. That's important that you know. All that means two chambers of government, two chambers or two houses of government, two chambers slash houses, right, of government. Okay. So large states, and we talked about Virginia earlier, wanted representation based on population. And obviously, right, if you were a big state, of course you were like, well, I got the most people, I should have the most say, right? They wanted their size to give them power. That was called the Virginia Plan because Virginia was the biggest state, right? So the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan, and all that did was it, wanted to give large states more power, right? Because of population. Cool. All right. So the Virginia plan wants to give these large states more power because of population, right? Well, the small states feared being dominated, so they wanted equal representation for all states, regardless of size. So, right, this is called the New Jersey plan, right? The NJ plan, right? New Jersey plan feared being dominated. They feared being dominant, so wanted equal representation. Cool. All right, that's the New Jersey plan in a nutshell. So, what was the compromise, right? The Senate, it was a two-chamber solution, and we get this bicameral, right, House or bicameral chamber, right, which means two, okay, right? So the Senate would provide equal representation for each state, right? Two senators per state, regardless of size. This protected the small state interest, right? So we have today, and if you know somewhat about politics, you know we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. Through the Great Compromise, we get the Senate and the House is created, right? The Great Compromise creates the Senate and the House, right? So in the new Senate, right, the Senate protects small states, right? That's their job, right? They provide equal representation. They provide equal representation, right? Giving each state two senators, right? So each state receives two senators, regardless their size. Doesn't matter. It's important that you note that the Senate is going to give you each state two senators per state, no matter how small or big you are. All right. And then the House, right? I call it's the House of Representatives, but we're gonna just call them the HOR, right? The House of Representatives, right? Their job it was based on population, with the number of representatives for each state determined by a population size. Okay, so they, you get and the best way to word this for you all, right, is to say it was based on population. Bigger states had more representatives, have more reps or representatives. Okay. All right, AP alert. Let me put you on AP alert real quick for the exam. This compromise is so essential to you understand federalism and how the Constitutional balances national and state power, right? The AP exam is most likely going to ask you a lot, right? And ask you to explain a lot about the structure of Congress and how it reflects this compromise or how it impacts policy making, okay? So for example, a free response question might say, hey, explain how the structure of Congress represents a compromise between large and small states. Or they might say, hey, describe how the Senate's equal representation affects the passage of legislation or like the passage of laws, right? This compromise right here struck a delicate, I'd say balance, right? It's a delicate balance between the interest of larger and smaller states, ensuring that their participation and influence in the legislative process, right? So, and without it, there'd be no constitution, right? So please, please, please understand these things when it comes to your AP test, okay? All right. The Electoral College is interesting because the Electoral College is so relevant to this day, right? It's a mechanism that still generates a lot of debate. There's a ton of debate over this stuff, right? The Electoral College is a system used to elect the President of the United States. And I want you to notice I said system. It's not a place, it's a process, right? The Electoral College is all about systems and processes. Um, Actually, let's go right here really quick, right? The Electoral College became this thing, or became a system that, used or allowed for compromise between two different ideas or perspectives, whatever you want to call them, right? So let me tell you how it works. Under the Electoral College system, each state is assigned a number of electors based on its total number of senators and representatives in Congress, right? So let's kind of draw that out because it can get confusing, right? So let's think about California. Let's think about Cali, right? There's a little palm tree. Let's let's think about California, right? This is Cali. Cali's a huge state. You all know Cali's a big state. So let's say Cali gets two senators, right? Remember, each state in the new bicameral system, no matter how big or small, you get two senators per state. California gets two senators, right? However, since they're so huge, they have what remember we call House of Representatives. They have 52 HORs, right? Or let me not say HOR. Let me actually do this. Remember, they're gonna put the whole word. All right. So they have 52 representatives. All right, great. Let's do a little math, kids. California gets two senators because of this, no matter how big or small they are from the Senate, right? But since they're so big, they have 52 representatives, right? So, how the Electoral College works is how many votes they get total, right? All you do is take this number and add it by the representative number, and they have what I like to call 54 electoral votes, right? Like Wyoming, for example, right, gets two plus one equals three electoral votes. Wyoming literally only has one representative, right? Let's think about Wyoming. Do I just put like a ball of hay to represent because there's nothing there in Wyoming, right? So Wyoming has again two senators. No matter what state or big or small, you get two senators, but they only have one rep, right? One rep, which means that's how many electoral votes they get. So at the end of the day, what you're quickly realizing is, and you say, Mr. Williams, this is kind of odd. Like, how does California get so much more say than Wyoming in a national election? Remember, the Federalists really did do a good job of, changing our Constitution, while the Anti-Federalists got a little bit, right? Sure, they get the senators. Two's not a big number to compete with the bigger states when it comes to representatives because bigger states need more reps because there's so many people, right? Um, Please be aware that when you get that kind of question on the AP exam and they probably ask you why, all right? So, let's talk about the electors, right? These electors cast their votes to officially elect the president. So, in the AP connection, what they're probably going to say is, you know, you know, well, before I tell you what they say, what I think I need you to know is you really, really, really need to understand the electoral college, right, and how it gives smaller states proportionately more influence than they would have in a pure popular vote, right? Now, granted, obviously, Wyoming, looking here with their three electoral votes, doesn't have more influence than California. But could you imagine if we were a purely representative system? Wyoming would have no votes. They wouldn't get any say so in a presidential election, right? So, a Wyoming voter has more electoral influence per capita, and this is going to sound crazy, than a California voter, right? The AP exam loves to test whether you can analyze how the Electoral College affects presidential campaigns, federalism, and democratic representation. Now, I do want to go back to what I just said about per capita because you're probably looking at me like I'm crazy, right? Well, think about it. California probably, let's just say California has 15 million people there, and Wyoming has 200,000, right? Three is a closer number to 200,000 and 54 is to 15 million, right? Sure, in the grand scheme of things, California has more say as a state, but the individual people of Wyoming have more say per capita because the number is just closer to the overall population than California's is, right? 54 is a long way from 15 million. Now, granted, 3 is a long way from 200,000, but it's closer to 200K than 54 is to 15 million, right? I hope that makes sense. If it's not, then, just email me or ask me in class to, clarify this, okay? All right. Oh, there's a foundational document I need to talk about. The Electoral College. Like the Electoral College itself is not a document, but Article 2 of the new Constitution, right, is a very foundational document. And it establishes this system, and the 12th Amendment modified it after a really messy election of 1800, right? So the compromise gave smaller states a proportional influence in the election process while still considering the popular will of the people, right? Though we've seen in recent elections that balance is a bit controversial, okay? All right, three-fifths compromise. This one is a bit wonky for some people to understand. So I think drawing it won't do it any justice. So we really need to talk about it. This is one of the most troubling compromises in American history, the three-fifths compromise. Right, this is another vocab term, right? Just along with the electoral college and great compromise. I'm sorry I haven't mentioned that earlier, but these are all great vocab terms you need to remember, right? Well, it's controversial, right? Because this compromise addressed the deeply contentious or problematic issue of how people who were slaves were counted when determining a state's population for representation and tax purposes, right? Let's talk about both perspectives. Southern states wanted to include slaves individually, fully. They said, well, they're fully people, right? Because that would help the southern states in the fight for representation, right? So, because they know it would bolster their political power and the representatives. But notice, they wanted enslaved people counted for representation, but not for rights. That's important that you remember, keep that in mind. The South wanted them for their own benefit, but not for the benefit of the enslaved people. They were still denied citizenship, freedom, and humanity. That's kind of what the South did, right? Northern states opposed it, right, because they argued that enslaved individuals should not be counted at all if they had no rights. Some were motivated by a more moral opposition to slavery, and others simply didn't want Southern states to gain more power through the institution of slavery. Now, please keep in mind, just being honest, most Northerners did not care if they had rights. They just didn't want the South to have an advantage over them, right? So please keep that in mind, okay? So let's talk about what the compromise was, how the South and North agreed, right? They reached a compromise that said each enslaved person would be counted as three-fifths of a person for both determining a state's population and the representation of the House. Let's be crystal clear. This compromise was extremely flawed, it was morally wrong, and it essentially was very evil, okay? The Southern states bolstered their representation through the institution of slavery. They gained a lot of political power by enslaving humans while denying them any rights, right? For your AP exam, this exam is going to expect you to critically analyze this compromise. You might see a question like, explain how the Three-Fifths Compromise affected the balance of power between free states and slave states. Or they might say, hey, analyze the extent to which the Constitution protected slavery, right? You need to understand both political calculations and the morality. Like, was it good or bad? Was it good or evil, right? You need to understand both. A foundational document attached to this is Article 1, Section 2 of the new Constitution, right? Though it uses the phrase three-fifths of all other persons rather than explicitly saying enslaved people, that was the way they would trick or, manipulate words to benefit, their representation. They wouldn't say enslaved people, they would say three-fifths of all other people, right? Now, this compromise has a lot of like lasting consequences, but we'll talk about that once we lead up to the Civil War, right? All right. The importation of slaves, right? This is following the Three-Fifths Compromise was another deeply problematic agreement, right? they postponed a ban on imported slaves. So think about it. Place yourself in the 1800s. I mean, in the 1700s. Some northern states were very much against the importation or bringing slaves in, and they wanted a ban, right? Southern states like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, they relied heavily on slavery and agriculture because it helped their economy, right? Remember, it was built on rice, tobacco, cotton, etc. And, they threatened to walk away from the Constitutional Convention back in Philly if the slave trade was banned. So let's say, for example, Georgia said, "Look, if you ban slaves, I'm out of here. Like I'm not agreeing to anything, right? Because you're trying to kill my economy, and I'm not gonna let it happen, right?" So like if we talk about the compromise, right? Um, it was agreed upon, the compromise was agreed upon to allow the importation of enslaved individuals to continue until 1808. So the North and South agreed. They said, okay, look, you can keep bringing slaves in until 1808. That is 20 years from now because it was 1788, right? So after 1808, Congress could ban that, right? Notice the language I'm saying. Could ban, not must ban, right? The South was very smart. They listened to everything. They listened to the language. Congress said they could ban it after 1808, right? So remember, could ban and will or must ban are two very different words, okay? So here's a key connection I want you to think about. This is in Article 1, Section 9, which prevents Congress from banning the slave trade before 1808. Congress did ban it in 1807, which was effective January 1st, 1808, but this compromise sought to balance the economic concerns of southern states with the moral concerns of those who were opposed slavery. Right? It provided a temporary resolution, right, that allowed the Constitution to get passed, right? And it temporarily protected the contentious issue of the slave trade, right? But you're going to see how this plays into the Civil War, a lot later in the 1800s, okay? But yeah, this exam wants you to understand the Constitution, how it both protected and limited slavery, right? This is kind of a perfect example of how the framers kicked difficult issues down the road for later rather than solving them at that moment, which created tensions which would explode, decades later, and which will get the Civil War, right? All right, let's talk about everything. Everybody's favorite thing to quote these days, the Bill of Rights. Uh, After we move to a compromise, right, that Americans would celebrate, we get the adaptation of the Bill of Rights. This compromise was actually made after the Constitutional Convention during the ratification process. So remember, kids, even the Constitution was ratified, which means like edited or changed, right? So here's what happened. Some delegates in states led by a lot of famous anti-federalists were concerned that the original Constitution did not protect individual rights and liberties. So think about this real quick. The Constitution created this powerful new federal government with a lot of power, right? So who would stop it from becoming like a dictatorship or a tyrannical government, right? Kind of like what they were, kind of like what Britain was to America. What were the protections for individuals? So the solution, and the best way I can tell you the solution is the compromise was reached. Federalists agreed to add a series of amendments or a series of changes, right? Known as the Bill of Rights to protect fundamental or your individual liberties, right? And your rights as an American citizen. And they will protect you from government overreach, okay? So what does it protect? Let's talk about the key amendments. And you need to know these amendments, right? I really urge you to know them, right? Let's talk about the First Amendment. Cool. First Amendment. Well, you know what that is. Freedom of speech. Freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. You have the right to speak your mind, have your own religion, talk where you want, make your own platform, and petition things you don't like. Okay? Second, the right to bear arms, so the right to own a gun. Not going to elaborate on that. We might get canceled. So let's leave it at that. All right. No quartering soldiers, which means soldiers cannot just randomly live in your house whenever they feel like it. No quartering soldiers. All right. The fourth, protections against unreasonable search and seizure. Protect against search and seizures. All right. Let's talk about the fifth through the eighth. Now, these are various rights, and we'll talk about them a little bit later, right? But various rights of the accused and protections in the legal system. All right, let's talk about the Ninth and the 10th Amendment, okay? All right, rights retained by the people, and the 10th states powers reserved to the states. All right, the Bill of Rights is a foundational document, okay? It's extremely pivotal that you know this, right? Particularly the First Amendment. It's the Bill of Rights is just one of these non-required documents that you all have to know for the AP exam. You need to be able to cite specific amendments and explain how they limit government power and protect our individual freedoms, right? The exam is frequently going to test your knowledge of how the Bill of Rights applies to contemporary issues. Like contemporary means modern issues, right? You might see questions about how the First Amendment protects or doesn't protect, right? Different types of speech, or how the Fourth Amendment, right, applies to digital privacy, right? So they might ask you something about protecting against unreasonable search and seizure, right? You may know it as like a policeman or somebody coming to like search you for weapons or something, right? But they might ask you something new and say, hey, well, how does this thing right here apply to digital security? How do you avoid getting unreasonably searched on the internet, right? So it's important that you know this. All right. Look, this compromise is going to do a lot, right? Um, it reassured change of the Constitution by addressing the concerns of anti-federalists, right? And without the promise of the Bill of Rights, member states like Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts might have never ratified the Constitution because they were so big, right? Okay, last two. Talk about the amendment process. Well, it's an overlooked compromise that you all need to know, right? Um, this thing was in Article 5 of the Constitution, right? So it's actually a really smart political design, right? The framers created a system that wasn't too rigid or like too stiff or too flexible, right? It balanced stability with adaptability, right? The amendment process provided two paths for proposing amendments. So these are the two. So the first one, right? There's a two-thirds vote in both houses of Congress allowing the federal government to initiate amendments. And this is kind of how every amendment except one has been proposed. Okay, and then there's the other part, right? The second one, 2/3 of the states can request a convention to propose amendments, right, or to ask for an amendment, which giving the states a role in, asking to make changes, right, to the government. This method hasn't really been that successfully used, but there has been efforts, so that's important, right? And regardless of the method, the final ratification requires approval by 3/4 of the states, either through the state legislatures or special state conventions. Meaning, for the AP test, I need you to understand the amendment process, or that the amendment process is critical for this exam, right? Questions might ask you, explain why the amendment process, reflects federalism, or describe the barriers to amending the Constitution and explain how these barriers affect constitutional change, right? You need to understand that this process is difficult, very, very difficult, and almost does not work. It requires things like supermajorities, ensuring broad consensus before anything changes. Okay, so I need you all to definitely know this. One major thing I'll tell you is why it's so difficult is the difficulty in amending the Constitution means we've only done it, I think, 26 or 27 times in the past like 240 years, right? Or 230 years, however long it's been, right? It's happened less than 30 times in that long, okay? So it's important that you know this. All right, last one. Contemporary issues like 9/11. Now, 9/11 isn't as contemporary anymore because 9/11 was like 25 years ago or 24 years ago, right? But it's still considered contemporary compared to the 1700s, right? So let's bring it to present day. Why does any of this matter, Mr. Williams? Why have you been talking my head off for these past 30, 40 minutes, right? Let's talk about the Bill of Rights and government surveillance, okay? Presently, the debate over government surveillance stems from tensions between national security and individual privacy rights, especially now with the internet, right, and AI and all these other issues, right? After 9/11, the federal government implemented these really, really strict surveillance systems and measures to prevent future terroristic acts. And we call this thing the Patriot Act, initiated by George W. Bush and his cabinet, right? But there's been a lot of concerns recently about the, potential harm and infringement on our civil liberties, particularly Fourth Amendment, right? The search and seizure, right? Remember I talked about earlier that you might get a question about, hey, how does it relate to the digital world? Well, here you are, right? Especially now with AI, right? This highlights a really ongoing struggle to define the appropriate role and limits of the national government in protecting the country, right? While this is representing individual rights. So this is the exact balance that the Bill of Rights was designed to do, right? So what's the federal role in education, right? Well, let's talk about the debates about the role of government in public school centers, right? Around the balance between federal and state powers. Let's let's go back to federalism and the 10th Amendment, right? Some of the questions that might arise, they'll say, hey, well, what's the appropriate level of government involvement in setting curriculum for schools? Should the government be involved in the funding for schools? Should government be involved in the policy for schools? Should we allow the states to handle this responsibility, or should the federal government create national standards, right? These debates highlight the ongoing tension between centralized or big government decision making, right, and then localized for state decision making, right? All within that framework we've been talking about of the compromises that came from the Constitutional Convention back in Philly. Okay, so AP exam. This exam, I've seen it too many times, loves to connect historical compromises to modern issues. Do not be surprised if they ask you to take a concept from 1787 and the Constitutional Convention to like something from like 2014. Be able to make those connections. You might see a question that says, using the concept of federalism, right? Explain two reasons why there's an ongoing conflict over education policy. Or they might ask you, hey, explain how the debate over government surveillance reflects constitutional principles. All that means is like old principles that were established in the Articles of Confederation or the U.S. Constitution. Okay. All right, let's wrap this up. We're gonna kind of bring it together. We examine these five major compromises, right? The Great Compromise, right? Getting the bicameral legislature, balancing these large and small states. We talked about the Electoral College, right, and how presidents are indirectly elected through these things. 3/5 compromise, people who were enslaved being counted as 3/5 for representation in the South. The slave trade compromise, right, being postponed until 1808, right, and then the Bill of Rights protect the states' rights or individual liberties, right. Look, for your AP exam, remember, know the what, the why, and how of each compromise, right? Couldn't be able to connect the compromise to constitutional principles like federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances, right? You need to be ready to analyze how historical compromises affect modern issues, right? And please know your foundational documents, especially the Bill of Rights. Please, right? The Constitutional Convention wasn't a gathering of perfect people who agreed on everything. It was messy, it was problematic, it was contentious, and it was deeply flawed. And the compromises were flawed too, especially things like slavery, right? They were made alongside with brilliant structural innovations, but understanding these compromises help us understand both strengths and limitations of our system, okay? If you're ever struggling, look, those foundational documents are, if you click over Unit 1, they are here for you to review. Please, please, please be looking at these documents as I mentioned them in these lecture videos and in class, right? We've talked about Declaration of Independence. We've talked about AOC. We've talked about the Constitution. Now, I'm going to get into Federalist 10 and Brutus 1, right? But please, please, please look at these things. They are so, so important for your understanding, right? I have them all here and all laid out with the descriptors to help you. So please, please, please know these. Okay, I will see you all another time.